Hi guys, this is Battle Lines. I'm going to talk about the lead up to the American Revolution. It's going to be called the Whispers of Revolution or Whispers of the American Revolution. This part is going to lead up to the Stamp Act, from the French and Indian War to the Stamp Act. Hopefully, give you guys some information that you might not know. So the first thing I want to talk about is before the French and Indian War was the Navigation Acts that basically forbid any foreign ship to come to the continental U.S. without going through Britain, and so that way Britain can control trade here, so that the British islands and the West Indies could have preference over Dutch ships. But they worked through that, even though it impaired the colonies. But the next thing is the French and Indian War. So the French and Indian War started around 1756. It was a battle. Despite the name, the battle is the French versus the British, and the Indians were actually on either side. There were certain tribes on one side of the battle and other tribes that were on the other side. And so it was really a battle between the French and the British and the British colonialists. So this battle started almost like a world war that became called the 7 Years' War. The Americans don't really know much about it unless you're into history, because it doesn't pertain to us. It was in other parts of Europe. Europe. Oh, it was between France and Austria. When the French and Indian War started, the France and Austria thought that they had a chance to seize land, and so they started to attack land that was owned by the British, and then the British are owned by Prussia, and then Great Britain and Prussia teamed up against France. But anyways, that's not pertaining to what. But basically, what happens is this French and Indian War that just became like a local conflict turned into almost like a world war, and the significant amount of funds that Britain spent on winning that war was huge. And so as the years came by, they decided they needed to recoup the funds from the British colonialists, because they as a way of protection, almost like protection money. So French. So, like during the war, like a merchant's view of what happened during the French and Indian War is the creditors were more than willing to lend money to almost anybody, that was that's going to be trading military goods. And for the years 1754 to 1763, business was good until the last few years. They were making money hand over foot, but they were also accruing debt from British creditors. And so as the war started winding down, they had issues where they had so much debt that they couldn't pay the British back, and they couldn't send, even during the war, they couldn't send gold to pay for the debt, because it was too expensive to send it because of raiding parties. And so it just became this big issue, and there was no balance, like in a supply and demand balance. The as supply goes up and the demand wanes, certain things happen to level it out. It eventually levels it out. But the things that like the interest rate was at a they call it, I guess they call it an exchange rate. It may be slightly different, but basically in today's parlance, the interest rate was low at the same time that the these goods were being thrown into the market, and so there was no leveling out of goods from this war. And so what happened is that after the war, you had all these people, and the article that I read was the economic consequences of the French and Indian War for the Philadelphia merchants by Harry D. Berg. He was talking about specifically in Philadelphia, but they had in 1760, Philadelphia had 10 years worth of goods at in Philadelphia at the time. So if you think about like how many years that would take to go through that amount of goods to be able to pay your debtors off, yeah, and so there's this huge financial issue in Britain and in the colonies. And Britain, they had just financed a global war, and not the colonies, they had created a trade environment that allowed people that didn't necessarily normally trade get into the trading business, but they at the end of it they couldn't pay off their credits, and so they came into the situation, and so a lot of them declared bankruptcy. Some of them tried to get an extension on their loans, and they would have to basically report on other businesses on their creditworthiness, to spy on other businesses so that the business would know. So there's just this dichotomy of that they had a lot of goods, but you couldn't sell it. The prices of everything went way up in the colonies. So I'm sure that affected everybody in the colonies. It just never. Oh, the other thing is like at the end of French and Indian War, they tried to pay off. A lot of merchants tried to pay off their debt with gold and silver, but that quickly sucked all the gold and silver out of the United States and sent it to Europe, and that prevented anybody else from paying off their debts with that gold and silver because it was gone. Once it was gone, it was gone. And so they had no way to exchange their money to gold to send it to England, because England had different types of money than what we had, and our money was worth near as much. Imagine if you borrowed $100 tomorrow from a friend, and then you tell them to pay him off in a month, and a month comes by and you hand them $100, and they say, well, that's only worth $1 now, so I need 99 more of those. That's kind of how they felt. They couldn't exchange it. They could, no amount of money they could exchange to be able to pay off their debt, and so there's a lot of frustration that came from that. On the Britain side of things, they had a significant amount of war debt from the cost of arming soldiers, feeding them, building ships, all kinds of things that they had to do. And they felt like that because they protected the American colonies from the French, that the Americans should pay them back for their protection. And the other thing that I didn't mention is that if you look at a map before the French and Indian War and after, there's a huge amount of land that the British have picked up from the French and a little bit from the Spanish, and they have to pay for protection. They have to pay for armies, or to be in those areas to protect the Indians. They had to build forts, so there was a significant amount of cost for that. So the first thing, that they tried to do was called the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was basically an amendment to the Molasses Act, and part of what the merchants were trying to do was is they had an illicit trade with they would trade underhanded the sugar and molasses, which molasses is a byproduct of making sugar. And so what they would do is they would try to trade commodities instead of trading money for debt. They would trade commodities like such as sugar and molasses and such. And so the Sugar Act, it reduced the tax for sugar, but it increased the strong hammer. You know, they forced you to pay the tax more than what they did before. So the British thought that they were doing a good thing by lowering the tax, but they strengthened the tax. And also the other thing with it is if you got caught, you wouldn't be tried in local courts. You would be tried in an admiralty court in Nova Scotia. So you wouldn't even be near your area where you were at. Excuse me. So it kind of was trying to help curb smuggling. The other thing was, I don't know if it was part of the Sugar Act or of other things, but they also there was certain restrictions put on trade to France. So they would have to, again with the Navigation Act that was before, they would have to go to, if they took an item from France, they would have to take from France to Britain, get taxed, and then take it from Britain and put it on a British ship and send it to the colonies. And so nothing was able to reach the colonies directly. Everything had to go through Britain and get taxed. And so that increases the prices of everything. The big thing was iron and lumber could only be traded with England. So lumber at the time, the colonies were huge forests. You know, we made ships and other things out of the wood, but we also exported lumber. It was one of our biggest exports, was lumber and metal and iron. So the two, one of the possibly like the top 5 exports were put on this list that we could only trade with England. And so there started to become boycotts of British goods to as a point of contention with the Sugar Act. This Sugar Act heavily affected specifically Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania, and that's from that report that I read. So the other thing they tried, and they were just trying like little things. The British government was trying little things to try to make money, and then they would do it and then maybe back off or, change things. So the other thing they did a currency act, but that basically meant that American currency was not valued in England. So you cannot pay any debts with Virginia currency. It had to be English currency or gold or silver. So that heavily affected all these debtors. And I don't know if it was at this point, but at a certain point, the creditors had hired people in those areas to go after the debtors and so force them into bankruptcy. But these creditors, the English creditors, were in debt as well, and that's why they were forcing the colonists to pay them because they had to pay another person above them. So the next thing that they tried was the Stamp Act. This was, as most historians, this is kind of where the revolutionaries start. The revolution kind of starts to pick up, because basically it's kind of like a wake-up moment. You know, people are seeing all these acts that I just listed off, like being lined up in a row. You know, they're obviously, their British government is trying to change the way that the colonies, the colony and the English government and the royalty interact, and they're trying to force more of a nationalist approach where the colonists have no say. They have absolutely no say in anything. They have no representation. There are no senators in England representing each of the colonies. And so this is where kind of things start to pick up with the revolution to a degree. So the Stamp Act was a tax on paper goods such as deeds, wills, cards, playing cards, newspapers, and even dice, which surprised me. So this may have not affected higher up people, because they may have had the extra funds that they could potentially pay for it. But people that were kind of in the middle or lower class, they couldn't pay. They couldn't buy a newspaper. Technically, they couldn't do legal documents. Every legal document had to have a stamp on it, and so they couldn't sue for like debt, like trying to fix their debt and things like that. And so it was hugely protested. Patrick Henry in Virginia stood up and spoke, and they spoke against it, and people said that was treason, and he said that if it be treason, make the most of it. And he proposed 7 resolutions against the Stamp Act to send back to England from Virginia, and 4 of the 7 passed. So, and also at this point, Patrick Henry's words start to get published in newspapers along with other cartoons and other people's opinion about the Stamp Act. So this is kind of where he becomes famous to the colonists. They excuse me. Stamp Act. So the Stamp Act becomes so divisive that there's certain groups that start popping up. They call them Tea Parties, or there's also Sons of Liberty. Some Sons of Liberty, I don't know if they're really considered a Tea Party, but people start making teapots with no tax stamp written on it, or like other items to show their distaste for this act. So that they passed the Stamp Act, and then like in March, and then November I think it was November it was supposed to take place or something like that. But the only place that they were able to collect taxes was Georgia, and that person had to run out of town because people were attacking him. And I don't think he ever gave his money to the government. He may have given back. Like in Massachusetts, they gave they took an effigy of the tax collector and hung him, and they went and ransacked his house, and he left town Most of the towns were like that. That they hung the effigy of the person, and the person either would refuse to say that they were the tax collector, the stamp tax collector, or they would leave town. So the British government eventually had to repeal the Stamp Act, and that gave the colonists positive reinforcement that their actions can make changes. But to the British, they thought that this was just like a temporary setback, and at the same time, they set up another act called the Declaratory Act, which basically just says that British is allowed to levy taxes against the colonies at any time. So it's got part of the Stamp Act that the Stamp Act, part of the problem is that there was no representation. It was just a national tax. There was no recourse for disagreement, or it just was the British government was demanding this, and you were going to do it. And so that they set up a declaratory act where basically any future acts that they declare were part of this declaratory act, which forced the colonists to pay their taxes or whatever that they decided. So I'm going to end there because I went to the Stamp Act. The Declaratory Act, I think, is really part of the Stamp Act, in my opinion. It was just kind of a response from them having to repeal it. So I'll talk about the Townshend Act and the Tea Party and all that in the next video. All right, guys, have a nice day.